The clock struck 11 p.m., and I could feel the weight of the darkness creeping into the hallways of the hospital. As a night nurse at St. Catherine's in Ohio, I'd worked countless shifts, but something about tonight felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond my peripheral vision. I stood at the nurse's station, the hum of the fluorescent lights above me echoing through the eerily silent corridors. It was a usual shift, until the new rules had been introduced just a few weeks ago. At first, they seemed like a way to keep things running smoothly during the late hours. But now, I couldn't help but feel there was something sinister hidden beneath the surface. St. Catherine's is an old hospital, and I've heard the rumors, the whispered stories of what happens after dark. Some say it's the spirits of patients who never left. Others talk about the old wing on the east side of the building where things disappear. I used to laugh it off. I didn't believe in ghosts or urban legends, but something about tonight made me question everything. "Welcome back, Aaron," greeted Kyle, the night security guard, his tired eyes betraying his lack of sleep. He had been working the graveyard shift for over a decade, and I trusted him more than most. "Thanks," I replied, giving him a half-smile. "I don't know why, but I've got a bad feeling about tonight." Kyle chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in it. "You're not the only one. The new rules, they're weird, aren't they?" The new rules were a recent mandate from the hospital administration. The higher-ups have been extra cautious lately, enforcing strict protocols on a night shift. Every nurse had to follow a set of bizarre guidelines, many of which were kept vague and unclear. For instance, we were required to check every room on the east wing every hour, even though most of the rooms were long empty. We were told never to enter the basement alone, and, most unsettling of all, we had to keep the lights dim in certain hallways. The rules didn't make sense, and I'd started to feel like they were designed to keep us in the dark, literally and figuratively. The first time I noticed something strange was a few nights ago, when I had to check on room 308 in the East Wing. The door had been wide open, and the patient inside, an elderly woman who had been unresponsive for days, was suddenly sitting up, staring blankly at the door. But it wasn't just her eyes that chilled me to bone. It was her lips. They had been moving as if she were whispering something. I stepped closer, trying to catch what she was saying. But before I could make out the words, the lights flickered and she fell back onto the bed. When I checked her pulse, it was normal. I hadn't told anyone about it. They would just say I was tired, that I imagined it. And maybe I did. But that didn't explain how my heart raced every time I entered that wing. I shook the thoughts out of my head. Tonight, I was determined to follow the rules, keep my head down, do my job. But when I walked down the hallway toward the break room, I heard something, a low, faint whisper, just out of reach. I stopped. The sound stopped too. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I glanced down the corridor, where the light above flickered faintly. No one was there. Still, the sensation of being watched gripped me tighter, like icy fingers on my skin. I couldn't let myself lose focus. My job was important. I had patients to care for. But what was this strange pull? Why did the hospital feel wrong? Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out, checking the screen. A text from the head nurse flashed across the display. "Don't forget the new rules for tonight. Double-check the East Wing. No exceptions." I sighed and tucked the phone back into my pocket. No exceptions. I had no choice but to follow them. And that's when it happened. The air grew heavier, the hallway longer. The shadows seemed to shift as I turned toward the East Wing. Something was waiting for me, something I wasn't ready for. As I stepped through the heavy doors into the East Wing, the temperature dropped. The sterile, white walls suddenly felt suffocating. I pulled my cardigan tighter around me, but it didn't help. I approached room 308. The door was shut. I reached for the handle and hesitated. There was an undeniable pull, like something was urging me to open the door. I pressed my palm against it, the cold metal sending a jolt through my body. With a shaky breath, I twisted the knob, and that's when everything changed. Inside, there was no elderly woman, no patient, no bed. The room was completely empty. But the whispers, they grew louder. I could hear them now, all around me, crawling beneath my skin. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't right. None of it was right. I turned and ran down the hall, my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The lights flickered again. Then, as I passed the nurse's station, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, standing just behind the station. Its face was obscured by a mask, but its eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, stared right at me. The figure was still. I didn't stop to look back. I bolted toward the exit, but as I reached the doors, something cold and sharp tugged at my sleeve. I spun around, but no one was there. I ran faster, desperate to get away from whatever just touched me, but the feeling, the oppressive weight of the hospital, it followed me. I could still hear the whispers, too. The hospital's rules, I realized, weren't meant to protect us. They were meant to trap us. I didn't know what I was expecting when I ran through the hospital corridors, but I never thought I'd be back here. The hospital was supposed to be a place of healing, safety, and comfort, yet every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into a nightmare. I couldn't stop shaking. My heart was racing so fast it hurt. But no matter how quickly I moved, I couldn't outrun the feeling that something was following me, or worse, waiting for me. I made my way to the security desk, hoping to find Kyle there. If anyone could make sense of this madness, it would be him. But when I reached the desk, the chair was empty, and the screens flickered as if something or someone was tampering with them. A sharp chill ran through me as I looked at the camera feed. Room 308. The camera feed showed a still, empty room, just as I had seen. But then the screen flickered. I leaned in, heart thumping in my chest. The image changed. A figure appeared, standing in the far corner of the room. It was only for a split second, but I saw it. A tall, thin silhouette that seemed to melt into the shadows, its face obscured. And it wasn't just standing there. It was moving toward the bed, toward where the woman had been. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. Something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. The lights above flickered, and the low hum of the fluorescent bulbs seemed to grow louder, almost deafening. I reached for the desk phone, wanted to call Kyle, but as I did, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly I turned, but the room was empty. Nothing. Just the flickering screens and the cold air. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had to focus. I was a nurse, trained to handle stressful situations. But this was different. I glanced back at the security cameras. Room 308. The figure was still there. It hadn't moved. It was standing, staring right into the camera. I swallowed hard and grabbed the phone. "Kyle," I asked, my voice trembling. "Kyle, where are you?" There was a long pause before the voice on the other end crackled through. It wasn't Kyle. "Leave the East Wing now," the voice whispered, and the line went dead. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't Kyle. But I knew that voice. It was familiar, like a voice I had heard in my dreams. Or was it a nightmare? I didn't have time to think about it. Every part of me screamed to leave, but the pull toward the East Wing, toward room 308, was too strong. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and headed back down the hallway, my mind racing. The whispers had returned, louder now, echoing off the walls, as if the entire hospital was alive and trying to speak to me. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, as if something was waiting for me just beyond the next corner. When I reached the East Wing again, it was colder than I remembered. The lights above me flickered in a staccato rhythm. It felt like the hallway stretched on forever, the walls closing in around me. Room 308. The door was open again. I approached slowly, hesitantly, but the moment my hand brushed the door handle, it slammed shut with a loud bang that made me jump. I stepped back, heart hammering in my chest, but before I could react, the door creaked open again, just a crack. A shadowy figure appeared, moving within the room. I didn't want to go inside. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I stepped forward and pushed the door open, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was dark, cold in the hallway, and as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with such force that I stumbled. I turned quickly, trying to open the door again, but it was locked. Panic surged through me, my hands trembling as I grasped the handle. The room was empty, just as before, but the air was wrong. It buzzed with an unsettling energy, as though something was just beneath the surface. And then I heard it, a voice. Not one voice, but many, overlapping in a chaotic jumble. Whispers, mutterings, a low, guttural chant that made my skin crawl. I turned in a circle, trying to make sense of the sound, but there was no one there. No one except me. Then my flashlight flickered and went out. I cursed under my breath and fumbled in the dark for the flashlight, but the whispers grew louder, closer. It felt like something was moving around me, but I couldn't see it. I heard the scrape of something against the floor, then a soft, dragging sound. I turned toward the corner where I heard it coming from, but I couldn't see anything. The darkness seemed to stretch on, consuming the room. My pulse quickened, the air growing colder with every passing second. Then I saw it. In the corner, standing motionless, was a figure. A tall, slender shape. Its face was hidden by a mask, but its eyes were wrong. Black, hollow, and they were fixed on me. The whispers became louder, a cacophony of voices, growing frantic. They were speaking in a language I didn't recognize, their words twisted and guttural. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The figure moved, slowly at first, then faster, its feet dragging across the floor, leaving dark, wet marks in its wake. I backed away, trying to find the door, but it was locked. It wasn't just locked. It was as if the door had disappeared. The hallway beyond the room no longer existed. I was trapped. The figure moved closer. Its feet scraped the floor, dragging itself towards me with an unnatural, jerking motion. The whispers became clearer, more distinct, until they were all I could hear. The sound of dozens of voices, crying out, begging, pleading. And then one voice rose above the rest, clear and sharp. You should have left when you had the chance. I felt it then, the cold, clammy touch on my arm. I looked down, and there, gripping my wrist with a vice-like force, was a hand of the figure. Its skin was black and slick, and its nails dug into my skin. I wanted to scream, to fight, but all I could do was stand there, frozen in terror. The figure slowly raised its head, its mask tilting slightly as if studying me. Before it spoke again, its voice like 1,000 whispers tangled together. You are part of this now. You will never leave. And then the world went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, my head throbbed with an unbearable pain, and the air around me was thick with the oppressive silence of the hospital. My eyelids fluttered open, but the darkness didn't lift. The world felt distorted, wrong. I was no longer in room 308. In fact, I wasn't sure where I was at all. The last thing I remember was the figure's grip on my wrist, the whispered words, and then nothing. Now, I was lying on the cold floor of a small, dimly lit room, my body stiff and aching. I pushed myself up, shaking with a sense of dread that gnawed at me from the inside out. The room I was in was unfamiliar. It had no windows, and the flickering light above me seemed to be struggling to stay alive, casting unsettling shadows on the cracked walls. I was lying on a thin cot, at least it felt like one, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. It didn't look like any part of the hospital I had seen before. My breath quickened as I sat up. Something was terribly wrong. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift, as though something was moving within them, watching. But there was no sound, just the steady hum of the dying light above me. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady as I moved toward the door. It was old, made of heavy wood, with rusted hinges. Hesitant, I turned the knob. To my surprise, it opened easily. I stepped out into the hallway, and immediately, a sense of disorientation washed over me. The hallway was unlike any I had seen before. The walls were peeling, the ceiling sagging as if the building itself was about to collapse. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the floors slick with something wet, almost viscous, like it had been drenched in something. My stomach turned. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But as I moved down the hallway, I felt the oppressive weight of the building's silence pressing in on me. I passed a few doors, but they were all locked. Each one seemed to be sealed tight, as if the hospital was trying to keep me in. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the far distance of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the flickering light. I froze. It was the same figure from room 308. Tall, slender, masked. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, staring at me, its eyes, dark, empty voids, locked onto mine. I couldn't breathe. My body trembled involuntarily, my hands growing cold with fear. The silence was suffocating, and every instinct of my body screamed to run, but my legs felt paralyzed. The figure stepped forward, and the darkness around it seemed to pulse and shift as though it were alive, following its movements. Each step it took brought it closer, and with every inch it advanced, the air grew colder. I could see its long, gnarled fingers twitching, and that dark, hollow mask never left my sight. I took a step back, my heart pounding against my ribs. I reached for the nearest door, desperate to escape. It was locked. I looked back down the hallway. The figure was gone. I didn't waste another second. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing against the walls, louder and louder with every step. The hallway twisted and curved in ways that didn't make sense, as though the hospital itself was rearranging to trap me inside. As I ran, I passed the same doors again and again. Each one looked exactly the same, as though I were trapped in an endless loop. Panic began to consume me, and I slammed my fists against the walls in frustration. Where was I? I didn't know how much time had passed, but I was starting to lose track of where I had been. Every corridor I turned down seemed to lead me back to the same spot. I stopped, gasping for air, tears threatening to spill from my eyes. My mind was racing, desperately trying to make sense of everything, but it was all a blur of fear and confusion. And then I saw it again. The door at the end of the hall. Room 308. The one place I didn't want to go, the place I couldn't forget. But I couldn't stop myself. I walked toward it, my body moving against my will, as though some unseen force was pulling me in. The closer I got, the colder it became. The whispers were back, faint but growing louder, twisting in my mind like 1,000 voices chanting in an ancient language I didn't understand. I reached the door handle, my fingers trembling, but before I could touch it, the door creaked open on its own. The room was dark, so dark that even the faintest light couldn't reach inside. But I stepped in anyway, my heart racing my chest. The whispers grew deafening as I crossed the threshold, and then I saw her, the elderly woman from before, the one who had been unresponsive, the one who had been lying in the bed. She was sitting at the edge of the bed now, but her face was twisted in a grotesque expression. Her eyes were wide open, black as coal, and they fixed on me with an unnatural intensity. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then the words began to form, distorted, garbled, as though she was trying to speak from a place far away. You shouldn't have come back. Her voice was hoarse, crackling like dry leaves, and the air around her grew thicker, heavier. A cold, rancid wind began to swirl inside the room, the walls seemingly breathing in and out as if the building itself were alive. The woman's body jerked unnaturally. Her hands reached out toward me, but they were twisted, bent in ways that didn't make sense. She began to laugh, an eerie, hollow laugh that sent chills straight to my bones. And then, from the shadows behind her, I saw it, the figure, the same tall, dark shape, but now it was standing in the doorway of the room, watching me. It didn't move. It didn't need to. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing on my chest, suffocating me. You're part of it now, the woman croaked, her voice gurgling with something unholy. You can never leave. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, and in that moment, everything snapped into focus. I understood. The hospital, the rules, the whispers. It wasn't about keeping the hospital running smoothly. It was about trapping us, keeping us here. The night shift wasn't just about taking care of patients. It was about feeding the darkness that lurked within these walls. And now it was too late. I had already been consumed. The figure moved toward me, its cold hand reaching for my face, and I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was already part of the darkness. I woke up again, but this time It wasn't the cold, hard floor of that strange room I had been lying on before. It wasn't even the hospital bed I had been assigned to for my shifts. It was a different place entirely, and I could feel the wrongness seeping into my bones even before I opened my eyes. My eyes snapped open to find myself lying in the same cot I had woken up in the first time. But this time, the room was no longer just dark and cold. It was suffocating. The air was thick, humid, like it had been drenched in something rotten, something ancient. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, breathing in and out, expanding and contracting with each passing second. I could almost hear the sound of something shifting, slithering behind them. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, hoping to clear away the thick fog clouding my thoughts. But when I looked around, the room was no longer empty. There was someone standing in the corner, the figure. I tried to move, tried to scream, but nothing came out. It was as though the very act of attempting to speak was swallowed by the oppressive weight of the room. My body was paralyzed. The figure in the corner was no longer just a shadow. It was something else, something tangible, corporeal. It was wearing the same dark, ragged clothes I'd seen before, its form tall and lean. The mask that covered its face was cracked, broken, and hollow. Empty eyes stared at me with a cold, silent judgment. I gasped, and somehow the breath left my body as quickly as it entered. My chest tightened, and I could feel my heart pounding erratically against my ribs. "You cannot escape," the figure finally spoke, its voice like sandpaper dragging across broken glass. It wasn't just a whisper I had heard before. This time it was more deliberate, cold, final. Its eyes never left mine, and as the voice echoed in my mind, I felt the chill of its words crawl into the very marrow of my bones. I wanted to scream, to fight, to escape, but every part of me was frozen in place. I could only stare back, terrified. How could this be happening? Why couldn't I leave? I managed to force my legs to move, though they shook beneath me. With a scream trapped deep in my chest, I scrambled toward the door, hoping that this time it would open. But as I reached for the handle, I realized with horror that the door had disappeared. Again, I spun around in a frenzy, looking for any escape, any way out, but the walls were closing in on me. My vision blurred and my heart raced faster and faster until it felt like it was about to explode. The air around me seemed to thicken and I couldn't breathe. The darkness pressed against me from all sides, heavy, suffocating. And then the whispers returned, louder this time. "You are here forever now." I collapsed to my knees, choking on the air that no longer felt breathable, clutching at my throat in desperation. The figure took a step forward, its cold presence emanating through the room. It was closer now, standing directly in front of me. I could feel its breath, even if it didn't have lungs. I could hear its whisper in the back of my mind. "You are not just a nurse. You are part of something far older. You were always meant to be here." My hands shook uncontrollably and my mind raced. Was this real? Was this my fate now? This endless cycle of torment, this prison of darkness? And what was I supposed to do about it? The figure reached out, its hand moving toward my face, slow and deliberate. "You are bound to the hospital, Aaron. It has claimed you." I wanted to pull away, to escape, but I couldn't. It wasn't just my legs that were frozen now. The very idea of running away seemed impossible. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked onto the figure's haunting mask. But just as its fingers were about to touch me, the door to the room slammed open. I whipped my head around in a panic. And there, standing in the doorway, was Kyle. My heart skipped a beat. How was he here? Was he real? Was this another hallucination? He didn't speak at first. He only stood there, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. But then, in a voice I barely recognized, he whispered, "You need to get out. It's all real. The rules, they were never meant to protect you." The figure didn't move. It just stared at Kyle as if it were contemplating him, studying him. But I could tell, Kyle wasn't frozen in place like I was. He was terrified, yes, but not paralyzed by the hospital's grip. "You shouldn't have come back, Kyle," the figure hissed, its voice turning into a distorted growl. Kyle swallowed hard, stepping closer. though he seemed to be battling against some invisible force that was trying to keep him back. I thought you were gone, Kyle whispered, but I see now it never lets go. No one ever leaves. No one ever leaves, the figure echoed in a low, menacing tone. Kyle moved forward, his eyes locked onto mine. He reached out, and for a moment, I thought he might pull me into his arms, that he might lead me out of this nightmare. But then, in an instant, everything changed. The figure lunged. It wasn't a physical move, but something more like a shift in the air, a shift that caused the walls to shake and the room to implode. Kyle gasped and staggered back, but he didn't fall. He seemed to be locked in place, like I had been. Then, without warning, the room began to break apart. I could see it, the walls splintering and cracking, the ceiling warping as if the very fabric of reality was coming undone. The whispers grew louder and more frantic, and I could feel the force of something pulling me down, pulling me into the very foundation of the hospital itself. This wasn't just a hospital anymore. It was a prison. Kyle's voice called out to me, frantic and desperate. "Aaron, we have to leave now. We're running out of time." But I couldn't move. My limbs were numb, and my mind was fogged. It was like my body was tethered to the hospital, to the entity that had claimed it. The room crumbled further, the edges of the floor falling away as if they were being devoured by the shadows. Kyle screamed as he reached for me, but before he could get any closer, the floor beneath him split open. He fell, his scream echoing into the abyss. The darkness closed in around me, and all I could hear was the whispers, the sound of the hospital, of the void. And the figure in the mask spoke one final time, its voice almost kind. "Welcome home, Aaron. You'll never leave." And then there was nothing. The void swallowed me whole. There was no sound, no light, just a crushing, suffocating nothingness that pressed in on all sides. I couldn't feel my limbs. My body felt weightless, as though I was floating through a dark abyss, untethered, lost in space. But there was a force pulling me, gravitational, cold, and unyielding, drawing me towards something I couldn't see, yet I knew was there. I tried to scream, but my voice was muted by the dense air that surrounded me. The fear that had plagued me before felt like a distant memory, swallowed up by the immense terror that now gripped me. I just knew, that if I didn't escape whatever this was, I would be consumed, forever a part of whatever dark force had claimed the hospital. Then a sound, a whisper. It came from deep within the nothingness, a voice that echoed all around me, but it wasn't just one voice. It was many voices layered together, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. The words twisted and turned, and I felt their presence gnaw at my mind, tearing at my sanity. The whispers grew louder, sharper, until they became a shrill cacophony, ringing in my ears, rattling my teeth, clawing their way into my skull. "Aaron! Aaron!" The voice was unmistakable now. It was Kyle. I snapped my eyes open, gasping for air. The air around me felt thick, heavy. I was lying on the cold floor once again, but it was no longer the dimly lit room I had awoken in before. It was the hospital, the real hospital, but it wasn't the way I remembered it. It was a warped version, distorted like a fever dream. The walls were peeling away, the floors cracked open, and there was an eerie, unholy glow casting long shadows across the hall. I slowly pushed myself to my feet, disoriented. My legs felt weak, like I hadn't moved in years, but I had to move, had to escape. Kyle's voice echoed again, calling me from somewhere far down the corridor. "Aaron, you have to hurry. It's not too late." My heart skipped. I wanted to run to him, to break free of this nightmare. But I didn't know where he was, and the shadows around me seemed to stretch on forever. I started walking down the hallway, my footsteps slow, hesitant, every step feeling heavier than the last. The hospital was different, almost alien. The sterile white walls were now stained with old, dark stains, and the fluorescent lights buzzed erratically, casting erratic, flickering shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but there was something else too, something colder, something older. The whispers were louder now, a thick murmur of voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They didn't speak to me. They didn't need to. They were merely there, surrounding me, as if the hospital had become a sentient being, hungry and malevolent. I turned a corner, and there, standing in the distance at the end of the hallway, was Kyle. But something was wrong. His figure was distorted, as though the very essence of him had been warped, twisted by the nightmare itself. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but they were empty, dark, hollow voids like the eyes of the figure. And he wasn't alone. The figure stood behind him, its form towering, its mask cracked and broken. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe around it, coiling in a grotesque dance. "Kyle!" I screamed, my voice breaking through the thick silence. But Kyle didn't move. He stood frozen in place, as if he didn't hear me at all. And the figure's eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, locked onto mine. You can't save him. He's already part of it. I tried to run, to reach him, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like the floor beneath me was sticky, pulling me in, holding me back. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I struggled against the invisible force. "No, Kyle, I can save you." But the figure's voice was like ice, cold and final. "You've already lost, Aaron. There is no saving anyone now." With a burst of strength, I finally forced my legs to move. I sprinted down the hallway, faster than I thought was possible, pushing through the suffocating air. My breath came in ragged gasps as I neared Kyle. I reached out, but just as my fingers brushed his arm, a sharp, searing pain shot through my chest. I stumbled, falling to my knees, gasping for breath. I looked down and saw it. The mark, the dark, blackened sigil had appeared, burning through my scrubs, etched into my skin like a brand. "No, not again," I whispered in horror. The mark was a sign of the curse that bound me to this hospital, to the very dark forces that ruled it. I looked up. Kyle was gone. The figure was standing in front of me, towering over me like a nightmare made flesh. Its mask gleamed in the flickering light, its eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I realized a horrifying truth. The hospital wasn't just haunted. The hospital was alive. And now, so was I. "It's too late, Aaron. You've joined us now. Forever." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The darkness was suffocating, pulling me in, wrapping me in its cold, inescapable embrace. I had become one of them. I was part of the hospital, part of the darkness that fed on the lives of those who entered, part of the cycle that consumed them all. And there would be no escape. Not for me. Not for anyone. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was the whisper, "You'll never leave. None of us ever do." The darkness that had once surrounded me now was me. My thoughts felt fractured, like the pieces of a puzzle scattered across a floor I could no longer see. I had lost all sense of time, and with it, the remnants of who I had been. Erin, the nurse, the woman who had stumbled into this nightmare, was no more. There was only the presence of something cold, ancient, and hungry, lingering beneath the layers of reality. I felt the pull, the same force that had held me in place, paralyzed, when the figure had reached for me. It was familiar now, comforting in its terrible certainty. The curse that had bound me to the hospital was more than just a set of rules or a series of cryptic messages. It was a web, an ancient, unbreakable bond between the living and the dead, and I was its latest thread. It took only moments, though it felt like an eternity, for me to realize the horror of my new existence. I wasn't just trapped here in this decaying version of the hospital. I had become part of its mechanism, its beating heart, its rotting soul. The whispers that had plagued me were now like a chorus in my mind, blending into a constant hum, so familiar that it almost felt like I was breathing them in. I turned, moving toward the empty hallway, instinctively drawn to a place I'd seen many times before, the place where it had all started, room 308. But this time, the door didn't creak open as I approached. It was already ajar, waiting for me. There was no one inside. Not anymore. The bed was empty, but the room felt alive, pulsing with an unseen energy. The walls closed in as I stepped inside, as if the very room was welcoming me back. I saw Kyle's face flash before my eyes, a vision, an echo of what had happened to him. His wide, terrified eyes, those hollowed-out pits that had replaced his once familiar gaze. I could still hear his voice calling my name, could still feel the cold emptiness that had overtaken him, had overtaken us. But something was different now. I felt it, a shift, a change in the air, like a storm brewing just beyond horizon, just out of reach. I turned, and there it was again, the figure. It stood at the foot of the bed, watching me, unmoving as always. But now, I could see the cracks in its mask more clearly, the jagged edges where its true face hid, as though it were wearing a mask of its own twisted design. Its form seemed larger, more imposing, as though it had grown in stature and power, feeding off the energy of the souls it had claimed. Aaron. The figure's voice was deep and hollow, almost welcoming, like an old friend, though the words carried no warmth. You understand now. You are one of us. I shook my head, as though the movement could deny the reality that was clawing at me, pushing its way into every fiber of my being. The memory of Kyle's face, twisted with that same hollow void, surged through me, but the figure's presence was too overpowering. No, Shoo! The figure raised a hand, its long fingers curling like the talons of a bird of prey. It is pointless to resist. You belong here now. All of you. It reached toward me, and I felt my own body give in. I couldn't pull away. The power that emanated from it seeped into my very bones, freezing me, draining me. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't like suffocating. It was as if my very essence, my identity, was being erased. I felt the years of hospital shifts, the long nights of exhaustion, the loneliness and fear, all of it, coalescing into a single, suffocating truth. I had always been a part of this place. I had always been one of its many lost souls. But it wasn't enough to just accept it. The hunger for more, for something greater, something beyond the boundaries of this hospital, was consuming me. The figure knew that. It saw the potential in me now, just as it had seen it in all the others. We feed on your fear, your confusion, your pain. The figure's voice was like a dark lullaby. We are the ones who keep the hospital alive. We are the ones who guide it, who make it grow. I wanted to scream again, but the figure's words kept swirling around me, wrapping tighter and tighter. It was true. The hospital wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, a part of something far older and darker than I had ever imagined. It needed us. It needed all of us, the lost and the broken, to survive. I stumbled back, my hands trembling, but there was nowhere to go. The walls pressed in from all sides, suffocating me. I was the hospital now. I was part of the darkness, the hunger, and the most terrifying part, I could feel it already. The instinct, the drive, to draw more into its web. I could feel the need to feed, to trap others just as I had been trapped. I was no different now than the ones who had come before me. You will be my guide, Aaron. You will show others the way. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my skin. And in that moment, I understood it wasn't just about the hospital. It was about the cycle, the eternal, unyielding cycle that had been repeating for generations. Those who entered, those who were consumed, became part of the force that fed the entity's hunger. It needed new souls, fresh fear, to keep it alive. And I was just another pawn, another cog in the machine. But now I could see it all. I could see the new nurses, the new faces that would walk through those doors, unaware of the rules, unaware of the curse that waited. I could feel them coming, like shadows on the horizon. The cycle would continue. I would continue it. And I would be the one to bring them into the fold. It is time, Aaron. The figure's voice was now almost tender, almost loving. Time for the next shift. I took a step forward, my feet moving of their own accord. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before me, a maze of darkness and light, of life and death. The doors were open now, waiting. And with that step, I understood. I would never leave. None of us ever would. I had become the nightmare. The hospital's hunger would never be sated. The hospital was no longer just a place. It had become my world, my prison, my purpose. I had embraced it, or perhaps it had embraced me. There was no longer any distinction between who I had been before and who I was now, only the emptiness of the hospital and the growing weight of its hunger. I could feel it. Every creak, of the floorboards, every whisper that echoed in the walls. It was all connected, all feeding into the same insatiable void. My every step reverberated through the halls, like an echo from a time before, and that deep, guttural pull I had felt from the beginning was always there, drawing me deeper into the core of the hospital's malevolent will. I was now its part, its conduit. I had no choice but to follow the path it set before me. The rule was simple, and it had never been clearer to me. Once you enter, you are never meant to leave. And if you try, the cycle will only begin again, with someone else taking your place. I had learned this truth too late. I had become a part of the hospital's cycle. But it didn't feel like an end. It felt like a beginning. The new nurses arrived, one by one, just as the whispers had promised. Their fear and confusion were like a sickly sweet fragrance that made the hunger inside me stir with anticipation. They were fresh, unaware of the rules, oblivious of the shadow that loomed over the hospital. I could feel them, their thoughts, their panic. I knew them before they even walked through the door. And I was there, waiting. I had never been alone in this place. There were others, many others. We were the lost souls, those who had come before, those who had failed to escape. We were the hospital's twisted caretakers, bound by the same curse that had claimed us all. We lived in the walls. We spoke in whispers. We waited for the next shift to come, to pull them into the web, to feed the insatiable hunger. Some of us had accepted our fate long ago. We were the ones who guided the new arrivals, showing them the rules of the hospital, the ones that made no sense, yet made perfect sense of those who had been here long enough to understand. We had learned through endless, excruciating years that we couldn't leave, we couldn't escape. The more we tried, the tighter the hospital's grip became, and the more the whispers came. But there were others like me who still remembered what it was like to be free, to walk outside under the open sky. We still held on to the hope that one day, somehow, we might break free, that we might find a way to sever the connection between us and the hospital. That was the thing about the hospital. It gave you hope just to take it away. It let you feel as though escape was possible, only to yank it from your reach when you least expected it. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps silent on the broken floor. The lights flickered above me, casting shadows that twisted and writhed like living creatures. I could feel them, watching me, the others. Their eyes were always on me, but their faces remained hidden in the darkness, their whispers growing louder, urging me forward. Find them, Aaron. Bring them in. It's time. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was Kyle's voice. But how could it be him? He had fallen, been consumed, just as I had. His face had twisted, his body had turned into a husk. And yet, I could hear him. I could feel him. I looked to the door at the end of the hall. Room 308. The room where it had all started. The room where everything had changed. It stood there, just as it had before, waiting for me. But something was different now. The door wasn't just ajar. It was wide open, inviting me in. It felt like a trap, a snare set just for me. But I had no choice. I was drawn to it, the same way I had been drawn to everything else in this cursed place. I stepped inside. The room was darker than I remembered, the walls closing in as if they were alive. The bed was empty now, its sheets torn and shredded, but I could feel the weight of those who had once occupied it. I could hear their screams, their pleas for mercy that echoed through the walls in the past. And in the center of the room, standing in the shadows, was the figure. It turned toward me slowly, its mask gleaming in the dim light. The cracks in its face seemed to grow, stretching wider as it looked at me with those empty, hollow eyes. Welcome back, Aaron. The voice echoed in my mind, cold and final, like the first breath of winter air. You're here to stay. I tried to move, to scream, but the weight of the curse held me in place. I was nothing but a pawn, a part of this endless game that I could never escape. The hospital had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others before me, and it would continue to claim those who came after. But there was something in the air now, something different. The figure's presence grew stronger, darker, more powerful. It was feeding on the fear, the confusion of the new arrivals, and it was growing stronger. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. I turned toward the doorway. The new nurse had arrived. She stood there, her eyes wide with fear, her breath coming in quick gasps. She had just entered, and already I could feel the weight of her terror. She was mine. She was ours. The whisper swirled around me, urging me forward. I had to bring her in. I had to make her part of the cycle. It's time, Aaron. She is the next. I could feel the figure watching me, its presence looming in the corner of the room. The new nurse was still frozen, looking at me with confusion and fear in her eyes. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the darkened room, of the whispering voices, of the shadows that seemed to move on their own. I took a step toward her, my hand reaching out. But this time, something shifted. The nurse screamed, her eyes filled with terror, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something deep inside me, a glimmer of resistance. I didn't want to be the one to lead her into the cycle. I didn't want her to suffer like I had. I didn't want anyone else to fall into this endless trap. I tried to pull back, to stop myself, but the hospital's grip was too tight. The whispers grew louder, the walls closing in. The nurse shrieked again, and in that moment, I understood I had no choice. I had to bring her in. The cycle would never stop. The figure's eyes locked onto mine. You know what must be done, Aaron. The next shift begins. I reached for her. She screamed louder, but there was nothing I could do. The cycle had begun again. I didn't know how long it had been since the new nurse had joined the cycle. Time had become irrelevant within the confines of the hospital. Minutes bled into hours, hours into days, and days into what felt like lifetimes. The air in the hospital was thick with decay, its walls closing in on me. I could hear the whispers always, that constant hum in the background, a chorus of souls lost to the same darkness. There was a change, though, something different in the air. It was as if the hospital itself was stirring, waking from some long, slumbering darkness. The figure, the mask-wearing entity, moved with more purpose now. It wasn't just a shadow at the edges of the hospital anymore. It was a presence, solid, looming, growing in power. Every time I crossed its path, it seemed stronger, more solid. Its mask cracked wider, its hollow eyes burning with an energy that felt like it was alive. I could feel it watching me, even when I wasn't in its presence. I could feel it breathing down my neck. The hunger within it grew, a gnawing need for more souls, more bodies to feed the hospital's eternal hunger. The whispers told me the truth. The cycle was about to accelerate. I walked through the sterile hallways, my footsteps now automatic, my mind numb to the routine. Every face I passed, those who had come before, the lost souls, the ones who had been swallowed by the hospital, had the same vacant look. Their eyes, just like Kyle's, stared at nothing, empty and hollow. But I was different. I could feel it. I was more than a guide now. I was a vessel. I stopped in front of a room, my hand resting on the cold, tarnished doorknob. Room 407. I had never been in here before, but I knew its significance. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest, the silent warning ringing in my head. It was the room where the hospital's heart lay, where the source of its power pulsed, thrummed like a beating organ. This room was the epicenter of everything, the wellspring of the darkness that had claimed all of us. I hesitated for a moment. Then my hand twisted the doorknob, and I stepped inside. The room was unlike any other. It wasn't just the peeling walls or the low hum of the lights. It was the air itself. It felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was charged with malice that could be felt in every breath I took. The shadows clung to corners, twisting and turning like living things, and the smell of something rancid lingered in the air. At the center of the room was a bed, just like the others, but this one wasn't empty. The figure stood at its foot. Its form was more defined now, its mask shattered into jagged pieces, revealing a grotesque, contorted face beneath. The face was not human. It was something else, something older, something darker. Its eyes were now glowing, pulsing with an unnatural light. And as it turned toward me, its expression twisted into something that felt like a grin, a grotesque and mocking smile that spread across its face, as if it could taste my fear. "Welcome, Aaron." The voice was like a death knell, a sound that vibrated deep within my chest. It was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. You've come for the heart. I froze, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from its glowing, soulless gaze. You've always known, haven't you? The figure's voice crackled like dry leaves of fire. Deep down, you knew there was more to the hospital than you were willing to admit. But now you understand. This is the true purpose, the true hunger. I swallowed hard. The room seemed to close in on me, and the air became thicker, more suffocating. I could feel the weight of the hospital pressing down on my chest. The whispers were louder now, growing in volume, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. It's time to feed, Aaron. It's time to take the final step. You will lead them all here. Lead them to the heart. My pulse quickened as a realization flooded through me. The figure wasn't just talking about the new nurse anymore. It was talking about me. I was the one who had to bring others here, to this room. I had to feed the hospital, to allow it to grow even more powerful. But there was something else, a darker understanding creeping into my mind. The figure had said it. This room was where it all started. The heart of the hospital was not just a physical place. It was the beating pulse of the curse itself. It was the essence of the thing that had claimed all of us. The figure wasn't just a part of it. It was the hospital. The room darkened further, the shadows curling inward like they were alive. The walls began to hum, a low, guttural sound that shook my bones. Aaron, you're ready. I turned my head to the side, my eyes drawn to something in the corner of the room. It was a shape, no, a form. It was moving toward me, but it wasn't a living thing. It was a mass, a writhing conglomeration of shadows, tendrils, and whispers. I could see faces. My face, Kyle's face, the faces of the other nurses who had been consumed, twisting in agony, their screams muffled but still audible in the depths of my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt paralyzed. The figure stepped closer, its form growing larger, engulfing everything. Its hands reached out to me, its fingers long and twisted, covered in what looked like tendrils of dark, oily smoke. You can't escape this, Aaron. The figure whispered, its voice dripping with venom. You will become one with the heart. You will be part of the eternal cycle. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My chest felt as though it was being crushed under the weight of the hospital's hunger. I could feel it pulling me in, sucking me into the depths, into the heart of its power. And then, just as the darkness was about to consume me entirely, a single thought cut through the terror. I realized the hospital wasn't just a prison. It wasn't just a place to feed. It was the heart. It was the thing that thrived on the terror, the endless cycles of suffering. But more than that, I was the heart now. I had become the prison. I had become the hunger. And in that moment, I understood the hospital's true power. It wasn't about keeping people trapped. It was about making them part of it. I had lost myself long ago. There would be no escape for anyone, not even for those who had joined before me. The hospital wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding on the fear of all who entered. And now, the cycle would repeat. The next nurse would come. The whispers would call. The hunger would continue. The weight of the hospital pressed down on me, its cold fingers digging deeper into my consciousness. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a labyrinth of torment, of fear, of endless cycles that repeated like the turning of a wheel. I could feel it in my bones now, the pulse of the hospital. It was inside me, around me, suffocating me. I had become part of it, a piece of the whole. The walls, the halls, the endless rooms, all of them were alive, breathing, pulsing with the same unholy hunger that had once consumed me. But that hunger wasn't just for souls anymore. It was for me. The hospital had claimed me, but it needed something more. It needed my will to be completely broken, my identity erased, so I could truly become one with it. And as the days blurred into each other, I felt the last threads of my former self slipping away, fading into the shadows that seemed to follow me everywhere. The new nurse, her name was Kate, had arrived only a few hours ago, but I could already feel the darkness calling to her. The whispers in the halls were louder, more urgent now. They always were when someone new entered the hospital. They had to be led, just like I had once been. I knew this. It was part of the cycle. But as I watched her from a distance, I felt something I hadn't expected, a pang of guilt. It had been so long since I had felt guilt. Long ago, I had been consumed by the hospital, and now all I was a puppet, strings pulled by the whispers, guided by the shadows. But Kate, she was fresh. She still had the spark of hope in her eyes. She still thought she could leave. And that thought, that flicker of defiance, burned in me like a spark in the darkness. I approached her cautiously. She stood alone in the nurse's station, her hands trembling as she tried to organize the stack of patient files in front of her. I could hear her heart beating faster, her breath shallow. I knew she was already feeling it. The oppressive weight of the hospital, the constant sense of wrongness in the air. The whispers would soon get to her, and when they did, it would be over. She would join us in the cycle, just like I had, but something was different about her. I could sense it. "Kate," I said softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. She turned, startled, her wide eyes meeting mine. I saw fear in them, but also something else. Recognition. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. She wasn't asking as if she needed to know. She was asking because she had already figured it out. She was already starting to see the cracks, the fractures in this world. "Longer than I care to admit," I replied, my voice hollow. "But that doesn't matter. What matters is you. They'll come for you soon." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Who will come?" I hesitated for a moment, the weight of my own words sinking in. "The hospital," I said, my voice barely more than a rasp. "You're already part of it. You just don't know it yet." Her eyes flickered to the shadows at the far end of the room, the corners that were too dark, too still. She could feel them, too, the watchful eyes that never left us, the voices, the faint whispers that danced just outside her consciousness. They were coming. I could feel it. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if trying to rid herself of the thought. "No, I'm not part of this. I can't be." "You will be," I said, a bitter truth spilling from my lips. "Just like the others. Just like me." The weight of those words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I saw the realization creep into her eyes, the horror settling into her bones. She didn't want to believe me. She couldn't. No one ever could at first. But there was no denying it once you felt it. The slow, creeping embrace of the hospital, pulling you into its depths, making you part of its endless cycle. "You don't understand," I continued, my voice breaking. "It's not just a job here. It's not just a place. It's alive, Kate. It feeds on us, on our fear. We're its food. And when you try to escape, it punishes you by making you part of it forever. There's no leaving. Not for me, not for you." Kate stepped back, her breath quickening as she took in what I had said. I saw her glance toward the door, her mind clearly racing with the possibility of running, of escaping. But I knew she wouldn't get far. She would never make it past the front doors. I reached out to stop her. Don't try. It will never let you leave." Her hand trembled as she gripped the door handle. She opened it slightly, only to slam it shut again, as if the very act of opening the door had caused something in her to snap. She turned back to face me, her eyes wide with fear. "What do I do?" she whispered. "How do I get out? Please." The desperation in her voice cut through me like a blade. I felt her pain, her fear, her confusion. I had felt all of it when I first arrived, when I first entered the hospital, and found myself trapped in its grasp. The thought of her suffering, of her becoming a part of the cycle, it broke something in me, something deep, something I thought had long been erased by the hospital's relentless grip. "There's nothing you can do," I said, my voice trembling. "You have to learn the rules. The rules are simple. Don't trust anyone. Don't trust the shadows. And don't look for the exits. They will just lead you back here. The whispers, they'll guide you. But they're not your friends. They're feeding the hospital. And eventually, you'll become part of it too." Kate's eyes shifted, and she shook her head, still trying to hold on to the illusion of escape. But she didn't understand. She couldn't understand yet. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't ready to let go of the hope of freedom. But the hospital was already pulling her in. The whispers were becoming louder, more urgent. She couldn't escape. None of us could. And as the moments passed, I felt something stir in me, something dark and unfamiliar. For the first time in years, I felt a sliver of resolve. I couldn't let Kate fall the way I had. I couldn't let her slip into the hospital's endless cycle, not without a chance to fight. I stepped closer to her, my voice low. I can't save you. No one can, but I can show you the truth. The truth of what this place really is. The whispers seemed to grow quieter as I spoke, as if the hospital itself was listening. And in that moment, I knew there was still a chance for me to stop the cycle. There had to be, but that chance was fleeting. The darkness in the hallway began to shift. The figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, its mask gleaming, its hollow eyes glowing with hunger. And with it, the cycle continued. The figure in the hallway moved closer, its form slowly becoming more defined, its presence heavier with each step. Kate's gaze locked onto it, her eyes wide with terror. The mask, shattered but still menacing, gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. I could hear the shuffling of its movements, the scraping of its twisted limbs against the floor. It wasn't walking, not like a human. It was gliding, as if the very air was its path. I grabbed Kate's arm, pulling her back toward the nurse's station. She flinched, her body rigid with fear, but she didn't resist. She was too lost in the nightmare unfolding in front of her. "Don't look at it," I whispered urgently. "You can't look at it, Kate. Not directly. It feeds on your fear. The more you look, the stronger it gets." But I already knew it was too late. The figure had locked its eyes on her. And as soon as their gazes met, I saw the shift in Kate's eyes. The light of her defiance, her will to escape, began to fade. It was as if her spirit was being drained, piece by piece. The whispers began to creep in around us, their voices blending together in a discordant symphony of dread. Kate's mouth opened, a breathless sound escaping her lips. What is that?" Her voice cracked, and I could hear the tremor in her words. She was already slipping. "It's the hospital," I said quietly, gripping her arm tighter, but it was futile. My words were nothing but echoes in a room full of shadows. "It's the thing that controls everything here. It is everything here." The figure stopped, standing motionless in the hallway, its hollow eyes fixated on Kate. The air in the room thickened, and I could feel it. We could feel it. The oppressive weight of its presence was pushing down on us, dragging the breath from our lungs. "Kate," I murmured, but I didn't know what else to say. The words didn't matter. The whispers were louder now, practically screaming in my mind. I could hear their voices clearly, urging me to sacrifice Kate to the hospital, to the cycle. It was what they wanted. It was what the hospital wanted. The whispers had begun, and they were becoming more insistent. Kate's hand reached out, trembling. "Please, I don't want this. I don't want to be part of this." "You don't have a choice," I replied coldly, my voice sounding distant, even to myself. The truth had already sunk into my soul. There was no escape. There was no other path. This was the only thing that remained. The endless cycle of the hospital. The cycle that had claimed me. The cycle that would soon claim her, too. Kate's expression shifted, her confusion turning to terror. I could see it now. The realization was flooding over her. The darkness, the endless cycle of the hospital, was beginning to consume her. The figure in the hallway started to move again, slowly, deliberately. Its arms were long, like twisted branches, its fingers ending in sharp, jagged claws that scraped the ground as it approached. It moved toward Kate, its eyes glowing brighter now, filling the room with an unnatural light. She recoiled, stumbling backward, but I could tell it was too late. She was caught in its gaze. "No, please," Kate cried out, her voice breaking, but her cries fell on deaf ears. The figure's hollow, broken smile twisted wider, as though it relished her fear, her helplessness. I could feel it too, the pull, the gravity of the hospital's hunger. It wanted Kate. It wanted her soul, just like it had wanted mine. And I knew, deep down, that once the figure reached her, she would no longer be Kate. She would be a part of the hospital. She would become one of the countless souls trapped here, forever wandering the halls, feeding the curse. Without thinking, I pushed her toward the door. "Run, Kate! Run now!" Kate hesitated, her body frozen for a split second, her eyes darting to me. I could see the desperation in them, the need to escape. But as her feet moved to retreat, the figure's hand shot forward, faster than I could ever have predicted. The sound of its fingers scraping the air was like the shriek of a dying animal. It caught her by the wrist, jerking her forward with terrifying strength. She screamed, a sound so raw, so full of terror that it seemed to pierce the air itself. I reached for her, but it was too late. The hospital had her. The whispers became deafening, swirling around us in an unholy cacophony, as the figure dragged Kate toward the darkness at the end of the hall. "No, you can't take her," I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the sound of her cries, the figure's laughter, and the whispers that filled the space. The darkness in the hallway deepened, pulling her in. I was helpless, completely and utterly helpless. The figure stopped just before the threshold of the darkened hallway, the one that led deeper into the heart of the hospital. It held Kate in place, its fingers digging into her wrist, the glow in its eyes growing stronger as it began to feed on her fear. Her body trembled violently, and her eyes, those once bright eyes, began to lose their light, turning dull and lifeless. She was slipping away, her will breaking apart in front of me. "Erin," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but I could hear it clearly. "Please help me." And in that moment, I realized that I had already failed her. There was nothing I could do. There was no way to save her from this place. I had tried, in the beginning, to resist, but the hospital's power had broken me down piece by piece. Now, I was no different from the others, just another lost soul, another nurse feeding the cycle. "Kate," I whispered, my throat closing in on itself as I took a step back. "I can't." And then, just as I thought it was over, the figure stepped into the darkness with her. The door closed behind them, sealing her fate, and the hallway fell silent. The whispers died down, as though the hospital had gotten what it wanted. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the hospital. And then it came, the sound of her scream, distant but unmistakable. A cry filled with fear, pain, and resignation. It echoed through the halls, reverberating off the walls. The hospital had claimed her. The cycle had continued. But that scream, it wasn't just Kate's. It was mine too. We had become one with the hospital, lost to the darkness. And now there was no going back. The hospital was silent after Kate's scream faded into the deep, endless corridors. The echo hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like a memory that would never let go. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where she had disappeared into the darkness, my mind reeling with disbelief. It felt as though the world had shifted, the very fabric of reality tearing in two, leaving me stranded in a place where time and space no longer made sense. I should have done more. I should have fought harder. But the whispers, the ever-present hunger of the hospital, it had drained me, wore me down until there was nothing left but emptiness. The feeling of guilt twisted inside me, a bitter, choking knot that refused to loosen. I had failed Kate, just as I had failed everyone who had come before her. The cycle was relentless, and no one could escape. A sound broke the oppressive stillness, a faint rustling from the shadows at the end of the hall. My heart lurched in my chest, and I instinctively took a step back, the air around me growing colder. The whispers had returned, louder now, swirling the dark corners of my mind, urging me to look away, to forget what I had just seen, to stop caring. But I couldn't. Not this time. Not when I had watched Kate's light fade from her eyes, swallowed by the very thing I had come to loathe. The hospital wanted me to forget, but I wasn't going to let it win. Not without a fight. I forced my legs to move, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the very weight of the hospital itself was pressing down on me, trying to keep me in place. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I could taste a metallic tang of fear on the back of my throat. I had to get to the nurse's station, the only place in this twisted nightmare where I had ever felt a semblance of safety. But even as I moved, I knew it was an illusion. There was no safety here. There was only the relentless pull of the hospital's power. As I reached the nurse's station, I stopped. The room was empty, except for the pile of patient files on the desk, all of them filled with names I didn't recognize, faces I had never seen. The familiar hum of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but it only served to make the silence feel even more oppressive. There were no other nurses here, no comforting voices or reassurances. Only me and the cycle. I stood there, staring at the files, trying to gather my thoughts, when I felt it, the unmistakable presence of something behind me. The air grew colder again, and I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the doorway, stood the figure, the same one that had taken Kate. Its mask was as broken as ever, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me with its hollow, unblinking gaze. I could feel the darkness around it, pressing in on me, suffocating me. "You!" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Why?" The figure remained silent, as if it didn't need to answer. It wasn't interested in talking. It didn't need to explain itself. It was just there, a force of nature, a manifestation of the hospital's unrelenting hunger. It wanted me. It wanted my soul, just as it had wanted Kate's. But I wasn't going to give it what it wanted. I couldn't. I had to find a way to break the cycle. I would find a way out of this nightmare. I didn't care what it took. I didn't care if it meant sacrificing everything. I couldn't let the hospital win. Not again. I turned away from the figure, ignoring the feeling of its gaze boring into my back. I had to act quickly. I grabbed a stack of patient files and started flipping through them, my hands shaking with desperation. Maybe there was something here, something that could explain the hospital's power, its grip on the people who worked here. Maybe there was a way to stop it, to break the cycle once and for all. The pages of the files blurred together in my hands as I flipped through them, but one name caught my eye. It was scrawled in messy handwriting on the top page, almost as though someone had written it in a hurry. A name I didn't recognize. Anna Williams. I paused, staring at the name. There was something familiar about it, something unsettling. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it nagged at me, digging into the back of my mind like a splinter. I kept reading, and my stomach dropped. Anna Williams had been a nurse here. She had been a part of the hospital, just like me, but she had disappeared several months ago. No one knew where she had gone. There were rumors that she had been taken by the hospital, that she had become another lost soul in its endless cycle. Her name had been erased from the staff roster, her record wiped clean, as if she had never existed. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Was Anna Williams another victim, like Kate? Had she been consumed by the hospital, her identity erased as part of hunger? And if so, could her disappearance hold the key to breaking the cycle? Was there something about her story that could help me escape? Or was I doomed to become just another name on a list of forgotten nurses? The whispers grew louder again, filling the room with a cacophony of voices that clawed at my mind. I slammed the files shut, trying to block them out. I had to focus. I had to think clearly. The answer was in the records. I was sure of it. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked toward the hospital's main desk. I had to find more information about Anna Williams, more about her disappearance. The more I learned, the closer I would get to understanding the true nature of the hospital. The more I understood, the more I could fight back. But as I walked toward the desk, I stopped. My gaze was drawn to something in the far corner of the room, a small, locked cabinet I had never noticed before. The metal was cold and old, rusted in places, but something about it called to me, as if it held the answers I sought. I moved toward it, my hands trembling as I reached for the lock. It was old, but it didn't resist. I twisted the knob and slowly pulled open the door. Inside, I found a collection of old files, more patient records, more names, and a single dusty journal. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was what I had been looking for. I pulled the journal from the shelf and opened it. The handwriting inside was spidery and difficult to read, but the entries were clear. The journal belonged to Anna Williams, and from the looks of it, she had been writing about the very thing I had been experiencing, the unexplainable disappearances, the whispers, the dark force that controlled the hospital. She had been trying to uncover the truth, just like me, but the last entry, dated just days before her disappearance, sent a chill down my spine. The words were jagged, frantic. I've seen it. I know what it wants. I've seen the hospital's true face. It's not just feeding on us. It's using us. It's feeding on our souls, on our fear, and it's creating something new, something worse. The journal abruptly ended there. The last page was torn. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized what Anna had been trying to warn me about. The hospital wasn't just feeding on us. It was using us to create something worse. I slammed the journal shut, panic rising in my chest. I had to stop this. I had to figure out what Anna had discovered before it was too late. But as I turned to leave the nurse's station, the shadows in the hallway shifted again. The whispers, once again, grew louder, more insistent. And in the distance, I saw the flicker of a light, the dim glow of the hospital's lights flickering on and off. I wasn't alone anymore. The whispers were louder now, gnawing at my mind like 1,000 insects crawling beneath my skin. I couldn't escape them. They were everywhere, filling the air with a malevolent hum that seemed to seep into the very walls of the hospital. The light from the flickering fluorescent bulbs above me cast an eerie, almost surreal glow, warping the hallway into a maze of shadows. It felt as though the very hospital itself was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I clutched the journal tighter, my fingers numb from the cold sweat pooling in my palms. Anna's words echoed in my mind, haunting me with their implications. The hospital wasn't just feeding on its victims. It was using them, creating something worse. What could that mean? What kind of monster had this place created? And what was I supposed to do about it? I glanced around the nurse's station, the stillness making my skin crawl. Every noise seemed magnified in the silence. The rustling of paper, the distant hum of machinery, the soft creak of the floor beneath my feet. It was as if the entire building was alive, its pulse quickening in time with my own. I had to leave this place. I had to find a way out. But where? How? I looked back down at Anna's journal, my mind racing. There had to be something in here, some clue that would explain what was happening to us. The answers were close. I could feel it. I started flipping through the pages again, scanning the spidery handwriting, trying to make sense of the fragmented thoughts Anna had left behind. But there was nothing coherent, just ramblings about the dark thing in the face of the hospital, things I couldn't quite grasp. The deeper I read, the more I realized that Anna hadn't figured out either. She'd been on the edge of understanding, but something had stopped her. Something had taken her before she could finish her work. Then, near the end of the journal, I found something that stopped my heart. A sketch. It wasn't much, just a crude drawing, almost childlike in its simplicity, but it sent a chill down my spine. It depicted the very thing I had seen in the hallway, the figure with the broken mask. But in Anna's drawing, its eyes were no longer glowing faintly. No, they were completely black, empty sockets that seemed to suck the light from a room. And below the sketch, in Anna's frantic scrawl, was one final sentence. It wears their faces. The blood drained from my face. The hospital didn't just consume souls. It replaced them. It didn't feed on us the way I had thought. It used our fear, our anguish, to create something that wasn't just a shadow in the dark, but a mockery of what we once were. It used the faces of its victims, trapping them in a nightmarish cycle of horror. I had seen it before, Kate's face, the way she had started to lose herself. But now I understood. The hospital didn't just want our lives. It wanted our identities. The implications of this were more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. If this place could take our faces, our very beings, it could make us into something unrecognizable. It could take everything we were and turn us into monsters. It's monsters. The face of the hospital was our face, warped and twisted into something else. I had to stop it. But how? I turned back to the journal, desperately searching for more. There had to be some way to undo this, some way to break the cycle. But as I flipped through the pages, something caught my eye, a name I hadn't seen before. Dr. Evers. The name leapt out at me, as though it had been waiting for me to find it. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know why, but something about that name felt important. I scanned the page, desperate for any clue that would tell me who Dr. Evers was and what his connection to the hospital was. The journal entry was brief, but chilling. Dr. Evers, the one who started it all. He wasn't a part of the hospital staff. He was something else. He brought the hospital to life, created it. He knew what the hospital could do, what it was capable of. He was the one who started the experiments. I froze. Experiments. My mind raced as I tried to piece everything together. Dr. Evers wasn't just a doctor. He was the architect of this nightmare. The hospital, the twisted things that happened here, all of it was his doing. He had created this place. He had created the cycle. But how could one person do something so vile, so monstrous? What kind of mind could conceive of such horror? The journal gave no more answers. It was as if Anna had stopped writing mid-thought, her fear paralyzing her before she could elaborate further. I slammed the journal shut in frustration, then quickly shoved it into my bag. I couldn't waste time here. I needed to find Dr. Evers. I needed to confront him. He was the key to everything. I turned toward the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. There was a door at the end of the hall, one I hadn't noticed before. It was set slightly apart from the others, hidden behind a layer of rust and grime. It looked old, almost forgotten, like the hospital had tried to erase its existence. But it was the door I needed. It had to be. I walked toward it, my breath catching in my throat with each step. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air became, thick with a sense of something dark and ancient. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. I couldn't turn back now. I reached the door and grabbed the handle, pushing it open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the room beyond was bathed in an eerie green light that made my skin crawl. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor was littered with old medical equipment, broken, discarded. But in the center of the room, there was a desk, and behind it, sitting in the dim light, was a man, Dr. Evers. His face was gaunt, pale, with sharp features that looked almost unnatural. His eyes were dark, hollow, as though he hadn't slept in years. He didn't move when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence at first. But I knew it was him. This was the man who had created this nightmare. The man who had turned the hospital into a feeding ground, a twisted incubator for something far worse than I could comprehend. I took a step toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. Dr. Evers, I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. You're the one behind this. You created it. You created the hospital. He slowly turned his head toward me, a slow, deliberate movement, and for a moment his eyes met mine. I could see the hunger in them, the madness. Yes, he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. I created it, but I'm not the one who controls it. You should know that by now. The hospital is alive. It grows. It feeds. And it needs you. A cold dread settled over me. I wasn't just dealing with a madman. I was dealing with something much older, much more insidious. This place had never been just a hospital. It had always been something more. Something alive. And it wasn't finished yet. The words Dr. Evers spoke echoed in my mind, reverberating like a sickening drumbeat. The hospital is alive. I could barely process it, but I could feel it deep in my bones. Everything about this place, every dark corner, every chilling whisper, every flicker of light, it was all tied to something far beyond human comprehension. The hospital was not just a building. It was an entity, a living thing, feeding on our fear, our anguish, our very souls. And it needed me. My heart thudded against my ribcage as I stared at Dr. Evers. His gaze was calm, detached, as though he had already come to terms with the horrors that swirled around us. He wasn't afraid. No, he seemed almost pleased, like a god observing his creation. You don't understand, do you? Dr. Evers continued, his voice soft and cold. The hospital isn't just a place. It's a living organism, and it needs us to feed it. Our pain, our despair, our fear. It grows stronger with every soul it consumes. And you, my dear nurse, are one of its chosen. I took a step back, my legs threatening to give way beneath me. My head swam as the weight of his words pressed down on me like a suffocating fog. How could this be possible? How could any of this be real? And yet, every shred of my being screamed that it was. I had seen it with my own eyes, the hospital bending and shifting, the things lurking in its halls, the figures with their blank, empty faces. It was alive. It was feeding. Dr. Evers leaned forward, his fingers lacing together on the desk in front of him. You see, the hospital doesn't just absorb souls. It recreates them. It takes the essence of its victims and molds them into something new. It uses them to grow, to become something greater than it ever was. Something far worse. I swallowed hard, trying to force the words out of my throat. What does it want from me? What do you want from me? His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a comforting one. It was cruel, twisted. You are one of the final pieces, my dear. You're the one it needs to complete the cycle, the face of the hospital. You've been chosen to become its true form. That's why it's been guiding you, feeding off your fear, your pain. You see, the more you try to escape, the more it pulls you in. It's been shaping you, just as it shaped everyone else. And soon, you'll be just like them. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. No, I won't let it happen. I won't become a part of it. I won't become one of them. Dr. Evers chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair. You think you can fight it? You think you have any control? This hospital has already claimed you, whether you realize it or not. You're too far gone, Aaron. The cycle is nearly complete, and soon you will join us. You will become the face of the hospital. I shook my head desperately, trying to cling to any shred of my own identity. I won't let you do this. You can't control me. I won't let this thing take me. I'll destroy it first. He shook his head slowly, pityingly. Destroy it? Oh, sweet child. You can't destroy what's already part of you. You can't destroy something that has been woven into your very soul. The hospital isn't just a building. It's a parasite, and you are its vessel. His words cut through me like a knife. I had already felt it, the hospital's grip tightening around me. The more I fought it, the more it seemed to pull me in, like an invisible thread tugging me towards some unknowable fate. I had never been truly in control. The hospital had always been in control, and now it was too late. My body trembled as I tried to process everything. What was I supposed to do? How could I escape from something so insidious, so alive? The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The whispers were louder now, filling my ears with a maddening chant. I could hear the voices of the other nurses, Kate, Anna, all the others, pleading with me to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But it was too late. A sudden, sharp pain pierced my chest, and I gasped, clutching at my heart. It felt as though something was pulling at me from within, something cold and unyielding, like an invisible hand reaching inside and twisting. The hospital was trying to claim me. I could feel it, crawling beneath my skin, sinking its tendrils deep into my flesh. It wanted me to become one with it, to lose myself. You'll see, Dr. Evers murmured, watching me with a strange, almost affectionate look. It's beautiful, really, the way it all comes together, the way the hospital becomes you. You will be its face, its true face. I staggered back, my vision blurring, my breath shallow and ragged. I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't let him win. There had to be a way out. There had to be something, some way to stop this madness. But before I could make a move, a sudden force seized me, lifting me off my feet. The hospital's power surged through me, crackling like electricity. I screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the rush of blood in my ears, the whispers, the pounding in my chest. I felt myself being dragged toward the far corner of the room, toward the wall that seemed to warp and shift before my eyes. It was a passage, hidden like everything else in the hospital, a secret passage, just like the ones I had seen before. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the hospital was too strong. It was too powerful. I reached out, my fingers scraping against the floor, tried to anchor myself to something, anything, but the pull was too great. The shadows swallowed me whole, and the last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Dr. Evers, his face twisted into a triumphant grin. The last thing I heard was a final, maddening whisper from the hospital. "Welcome home, Aaron. You're finally where you belong."